The wind was a raw file, scraping bone-deep cold across the plains. Anya huddled deeper into the meager shelter of the rock overhang. The course will shawl thin comfort against the prairie's brutal indifference. Dust, fine as ash, coated her tongue, a constant reminder of thirst. Days bled into a colorless stream since the raiders had come, leaving only ghosts and the acrid scent of smoke on the wind. Her village, her family, gone. The silence that followed had been the loudest thing she had ever known, a ringing void that amplified her terror. She was alone, a woman young and unprotected, in a land that offered no mercy. Every rustle of dry grass, every shadow stretching with the setting sun, was a potential threat. Hunger gnawed, a dull, constant ache beneath the sharp pangs of grief. She watched the horizon, a bleak line separating the bruised twilight sky from the unforgiving earth. Her eyes, once bright, were shadowed with a fear that felt ancient, instinctual. This land knew cruelty intimately, wore it like a shroud. She had seen it consume before, chew up the weak and leave nothing but scattered dust. Survival felt less like hope and more like a grim, exhausting duty. She thought of her mother's hands, calloused and strong, weaving baskets, preparing meals. Thought of laughter around the fire. These memories were dangerous, sharp splinters in her heart. They weakened her resolve, tempting her towards despair. She had to push them down, bury them beneath the immediate need to endure. Breathe, scan, listen, live. But the will felt thin, frayed like the edge of her worn moccasins. She was a bird with a broken wing, lost in a sky too vast and too cruel. The cold seeped through her skin, promising oblivion. It was a tempting offer, a surrender to the inevitable. Yet, a flicker remained, a stubborn refusal to let the emptiness claim her entirely. It was born of pride, perhaps, or simply the animal instinct to cling to life. She was of this land, shaped by its harsh beauty, even as it sought to break her. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for her. Fear tightened its grip, a cold hand squeezing her chest. She had to move, find better shelter, water, anything. But her limbs felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion and the crushing weight of her solitude. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability. A lone female in a world populated by predators, both human and animal. A different kind of chill settled over her, colder than the wind. The threat was not just the elements. It was the eyes that might find her, the intentions that lurked beyond the horizon. She had seen the casual brutality of men who saw her kind as less than human, as objects to be taken or discarded. This was the greater fear, the one that kept her breath shallow and her muscles tensed. The night deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of light. The stars emerged, cold pinpricks in the vast darkness, indifferent witnesses to her plight. She pulled the shawl tighter, the rough wool scratching her cheek. Tomorrow. She had to survive until tomorrow. The thought was a fragile seed, planted in barren ground. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, to gather the tattered remnants of her strength. When she opened them, a faint glow flickered in the distance. A fire, and near it a shape, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. Not one of her people, a settler. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of alarm. More danger, or perhaps the barest, most fragile possibility of something else. She watched, frozen, weighing the overwhelming risk against the desperate, gnawing need. The figure by the fire was large, broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the low flames. He moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of purpose, stacking wood, tending the small blaze. He was alone, that much was clear, alone like her. But his solitude seemed deliberate, self-imposed, not the stark, terrifying loneliness that had become her constant companion. She stayed hidden in the shadows of the rocks, her body tense, ready to flee at the slightest sign of threat. Her ancestors had told stories of these men who came with their wagons and their fences, carving up the land, driving away the buffalo, bringing sickness and sorrow. They were the invaders, the destroyers. Yet this one sat by his fire, a seemingly ordinary man simply trying to stay warm. She watched him for a long time, hunger a dull ache, fear a sharp edge. He ate from a pan, something that smelled of cooked meat, a scent that made her stomach cramp with longing. He didn't scan the surroundings with the hypervigilance of one expecting attack. His gaze was steady, directed mostly at the fire or the simple tasks he performed. This lack of overt suspicion was both reassuring and unnerving. It suggested either profound confidence or dangerous naivety. She couldn't afford to gamble on the latter. But the cold was relentless, and her strength was ebbing. The thought of warmth, of food, was a powerful lure. It battled against the ingrained caution, the warnings whispered since childhood. Hesitantly, painstakingly, she began to move, not directly towards him, but circling wide, staying low, using the terrain for cover. A broken twig underfoot would betray her. A misplaced step would invite disaster. She moved with the silent grace of her people, a skill honed over generations of living in harmony with the land, observing its rhythms, understanding its dangers. She drew closer, the warmth of the fire a tangible presence on the cold air. She could make out more details now. A worn canvas coat, heavy boots, a rifle leaning against a saddle a short distance away. He had a beard, dark and slightly unruly. His face, when he turned it towards the firelight, was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of hard living. His eyes, when they occasionally lifted to scan the darkness, seemed watchful, yes, but not hostile, merely observant. Still, the rifle was there, a symbol of his power, his ability to end her life with a swift, loud sound. She paused again, hidden behind a low ridge, her breath shallow. What was he doing out here, alone? Most settlers moved in groups, wary of the dangers of the open country. Was he lost? A scout? Or something else? The uncertainty tightened the knot of fear in her stomach. But then, a shiver ran through her body, deep and uncontrollable. She hugged herself, teeth chattering. The cold was winning. The choice felt stark. Remain hidden and likely freeze or starve, or reveal herself to the unknown and face whatever consequence that brought. Survival demanded she take the risk. Gathering every scrap of courage she possessed, she rose slowly from behind the ridge, her movements deliberate, non-threatening. She kept her hands visible, empty. She was small against the vast night, a fragile silhouette etched against the faint glow of his fire. His head snapped up instantly. His hand went instinctively towards the rifle. Her heart leaped into her throat. For a long moment, neither of them moved. His gaze was intense, assessing. She met it directly, showing neither fear nor aggression, just the simple, desperate need that had driven her here. The silence stretched, thick with tension and unspoken questions. He didn't raise the rifle. Not yet. The man's hand remained near the rifle, but he didn't raise it. His eyes, surprisingly pale in the firelight, studied her with an unnerving stillness. She stood her ground, a fragile figure in the vast darkness, acutely aware of her vulnerability. Her gaze didn't falter. She offered no words, knew none that he would understand anyway. Her posture, her stillness, had to convey everything, that she was alone, unarmed, and in dire need, not a threat. He finally lowered his hand from the rifle, a movement slow and deliberate. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't outright rejection either. A test, perhaps, or a reluctant acknowledgement of her presence. He gestured towards the fire with a slight inclination of his head. It was minimal, stoic, lacking any warmth of expression, but it was a gesture nonetheless. Hesitantly, she took a step forward, then another. Each step felt like crossing a threshold, leaving behind the relative safety of anonymity for the exposed uncertainty of interaction. As she neared the fire, she felt its warmth on her skin, a physical relief so profound it almost made her knees buckle. She sank to the ground a respectful distance away, keeping her eyes on him, ready to react. He watched her settle, his expression unreadable. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, but his face held a weariness that aged him. There was a guardedness about him, a sense of someone who had learned to rely only on himself. He didn't offer food or speak. He simply returned to tending his fire, his actions speaking louder than any words. This was acceptance on the harshest terms, permission to exist in his vicinity, nothing more. Yet, in the face of the prairie's relentless hostility, even this small allowance felt like a lifeline. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with unspoken history, with suspicion and apprehension born of conflict and misunderstanding between their peoples. She felt the weight of it, the invisible barrier between them. But as the fire chased away the deep chill, and the scent of cooking food continued to tantalize, the raw instinct for survival began to override the historical animosity. He was a human being, offering a shared space, however grudgingly. She was a human being in need. For tonight, perhaps that was enough. He reached for the pan he had been eating from, scraped out a small portion onto a tin plate, and pushed it towards her with a stick. He still didn't look directly at her. It was a gesture devoid of overt kindness, almost impersonal, but the action itself was undeniable. Food. Her eyes welled up unexpectedly. Tears she quickly blinked away. She nodded her thanks, a small, jerky movement. She took the plate, the tin warm against her cold fingers. The food was simple beans and pieces of meat, but it was sustenance. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, acutely aware of his silent presence. He finally looked at her as she ate, his gaze less wary now, more curious, observing. She couldn't tell. She avoided his eyes, focusing on the food, on the simple act of nourishing her body. When she finished, she pushed the plate back towards the fire. He took it without a word, set it aside. The silence returned, less heavy this time, replaced by a tentative truce. She felt a sliver of something other than fear, a fragile sense of safety, temporary though it might be. He was an enigma, this quiet man of the settlers. Not the monster of the stories, but a man with weary eyes and a guarded heart, who nonetheless shared his fire and his food with a stranger from a feared tribe. As the night wore on, she watched him tend the fire, check the hobbled horses nearby, his movements economical and purposeful. He seemed comfortable in his solitude, self-sufficient. She, who had always known the warmth of community, found his independence both alien and admirable. It spoke of a different kind of strength, one she was now being forced to cultivate within herself. The fire crackled, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness. For the first time since the raid, she felt a moment of respite, a fragile bubble of safety in a dangerous world. It was thanks to this stranger, this man from the other side. It was a dangerous dependence, a dangerous connection, but in the heart of the wilderness, danger was everywhere. At least this danger came with fire and food. Days blurred together, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the quiet rhythm of their shared existence by the fire. He was called Jed. He had offered the name after the first night, a gruff sound accompanied by a slight nod. She, in turn, offered her own name, a soft murmur that seemed to hang in the air between them. There was no attempt at conversation, not in words they could both understand. Their communication remained a language of gestures, of shared silence, of observing each other's movements and intentions. Jed was a man of routine. He rose before dawn, tended the horses, scouted the immediate area with a quiet vigilance she now recognized as ingrained caution, not fear. He hunted sparingly, always returning with just enough for their needs, showing a respect for the land she hadn't expected from a settler. He was skilled with his rifle, his movements precise and economical. He spent hours cleaning and maintaining it, a ritual that spoke of reliance and trust in his tools. She, in turn, demonstrated her own skills. She knew the edible plants that survived the harsh climate, the ones he overlooked. She found water sources hidden from his less practiced eyes. She could move through the terrain with a silence that startled him initially, a ghost in the landscape. There was a quiet acknowledgement of each other's capabilities, a grudging respect that grew in the fertile ground of shared necessity. He saw her resilience, her ability to survive with nothing but her wits and her knowledge of the land. She saw his quiet strength, his self-reliance, his unexpected restraint. He never pressed her with questions, never attempted to impose his will. He simply existed alongside her, a parallel line in the harsh equation of survival. The unspoken tension between them began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of companionship. They were two solitary figures, cast adrift in a hostile world, finding a strange, temporary harbor in each other's presence. The danger wasn't just external. It lay also in this burgeoning connection. She knew their association was forbidden, would be met with hostility from both their peoples, should they be discovered. His people saw hers as savages, obstacles to be removed. Her people saw his as invaders, destroyers. This shared space by the fire was a small, defiant bubble against the weight of history and prejudice. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. A white man. Jed tensed, his hand going to his rifle. He looked at her, a brief, sharp glance that communicated the immediate threat. Hide. She didn't hesitate, melting back into the rocks, becoming one with the landscape. She watched from her concealment as the man rode up to Jed's camp. He was loud, boisterous, his voice carrying on the wind. He wore a gun belt, swaggered even on horseback. He spoke quickly, his words sharp and dismissive. Jed answered sparingly, his body language guarded. The man's eyes flicked towards the rocks where she was hidden, a casual, speculative glance that sent a shiver down her spine. He was the kind of man she feared most, one who saw the world through a lens of entitlement and cruelty. He stayed for a while, talking, gesturing towards the west. Jed remained impassive, offering little. Finally, the man rode off, his laughter echoing back on the wind. Jed waited until the rider was a distant speck before signaling her to return. As she emerged, he looked at her, his pale eyes troubled. Trouble, he said, the single word rough. He pointed after the rider. Lookin' for runaways, he hesitated, then added, and others. The implication hung heavy in the air. Her people, or perhaps women like her, alone and vulnerable. The world outside their fragile bubble was closing in. Their temporary peace was under threat. The fragile bond they had forged, born of necessity and quiet understanding, was about to be tested. The danger was no longer a vague possibility. It had a face, a voice, and it was riding away, potentially bringing others. The man who had ridden away was Luke, a tracker known for his ruthlessness and his cruelty, particularly towards tribal people. Jed knew his presence meant trouble. Luke was likely scouting for others, maybe soldiers or more hostile settlers, drawn by rumors of remaining scattered groups after the raid. Or worse, specifically looking for survivors to exploit. The fragile peace they had found was over. We move, Jed stated, his voice low and firm. He began packing his meager camp with swift, efficient movements. There was no debate, no hesitation. She understood. Staying meant certain discovery and potential capture or death. Moving meant facing the harsh wilderness, but with the slim hope of eluding their pursuers. This time, they moved together, no longer simply coexisting but acting as a unit. Jed took the lead, his knowledge of the terrain different from hers, but effective. She followed, her eyes constantly scanning, using her own instincts to read the signs the land offered. A disturbed rock, a faint track Jed might miss, the subtle shift in the behavior of birds. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the day in gullies or dense thickets, enduring the cold and the gnawing hunger. The silence between them was now different, filled with a shared purpose, a mutual reliance. There was no need for words. A glance, a hand signal, a shared look of weariness or alert tension was enough. One morning, hidden in a narrow canyon, they heard the distant sound of horses. Luke and others. They were close. Jed's face was grim. He looked at her, his gaze holding a rare vulnerability. He could try to outrun them, maybe, but with her, it would be harder, riskier for him. He didn't have to stay. The thought flickered through her mind, cold and sharp. He owed her nothing. He could leave her, disappear into the vastness, save himself. She would understand. Survival was the first law. But he didn't leave. Instead, he reached out, his hand closing briefly around her arm. His grip was firm, a silent promise. He pointed towards a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, almost invisible from below. Higher ground. A better vantage point, a place to make a stand if necessary. She nodded, understanding. As they scrambled up, the sound of the riders grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. They reached the crevice, a small, protected ledge offering a view of the canyon floor. Below, Luke and two other men rode past, their eyes scanning, but focused on the obvious trails. They were loud, careless in their confidence. They didn't see the subtle signs of their passage. They didn't see her. She watched them go, her heart pounding. Jed knelt beside her, his rifle ready. He didn't look at the riders. His attention was on her, ensuring she was safe, hidden. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. He had chosen to stay. He had chosen to protect her. The danger had solidified their fragile bond, transforming tentative trust into something deeper, unspoken, fierce. They waited until the sounds of the horses faded completely before daring to breathe normally. The relief was immense, a physical release of tension that left them both trembling slightly. Jed met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his pale eyes that mirrored the turmoil in her own heart. A mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something that looked undeniably like care. He reached out again, this time not for her arm, but cupping her cheek gently. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly tender. Safe. For now, he murmured, the words simple, profound. She leaned into his touch for a brief moment, acknowledging the truth and the complexity of it. They were safe not because the world had become kind, but because they had faced its cruelty together. The journey had stripped away her defenses, exposed her vulnerability, but in doing so, it had also revealed her own strength, her resilience, a core of steel she hadn't known she possessed. And in this quiet, solitary man, she had found an unexpected ally, a partner in survival, a reflection of her own struggle and determination. The world outside was still dangerous, still filled with prejudice and hardship. Their path forward was uncertain, fraught with peril, but they were no longer alone. They faced it together, two figures etched against the vast, indifferent landscape, bound by the silent language of shared adversity and the quiet strength of a connection forged in the heart of the storm. It wasn't a storybook ending, not a triumphant arrival. It was simply existence, side by side, in a world that tested the limits of endurance. But in that shared existence, in that quiet partnership, lay a profound, resilient hope. The journey had been brutal, marked by loss and fear, but it had led her here, to this place, to this man, to the rediscovery of her own unbreakable spirit. And in the aftermath of the storm, facing an uncertain dawn that felt like everything